More than 300 years ago, a Scottish minister and historian named Robert Wardrow wrote a hurried letter to his wife describing what he had just witnessed at the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland. He was recording events in real time. The letter was never meant for publication. It was simply a private message sent home to his family. But today, those letters survive in a remarkable collection known as the Wardrow correspondence, and through them, we gain a rare window into the religious and political tensions shaping Britain in the early 18th century. Tensions that had been building for decades, ever since a rebellion shook the kingdom and left a trail of executions, exile, and fear across the land. Wardrow begins his letter this way: "My heart, because I want time very much, I will just give you the news and send them west to your father by the post as they come by you. This day Mr. Carstairs preached before the commissioner at the opening of the assembly upon Psalm 122, the last verse. His doctrine in general was that every good person should be of a public spirit and be concerned about the good of the house of God as well as civil interests." The preacher mentioned here was William Carstairs. Carstairs was not simply a minister. He was one of the most influential political figures in Scotland and a trusted advisor to the British Crown. When Carstairs spoke about the relationship between religion and public life, people listened carefully, because behind these sermons were deeper conflicts that had recently erupted into rebellion, conflicts that had divided England and Scotland over the future of the monarchy, the church, and the nation itself. Wardrow continues, "He proved it from several examples in scripture: Moses, the instance of the woman in 1 Samuel chapter 4, the last two verses, David, and several others. He then gave the reasons for it and the methods by which we are to evidence our public spirit, not in any unlawful thing, but in everything suitable to our stations, in prayer, in maintaining the communion of saints, in keeping the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace, and in walking wisely toward those who are without." The phrase "those who are without" referred to those outside the Presbyterian Church. At the time, Scotland was deeply divided between competing religious communities. Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and political factions loyal to rival claimants to the throne all struggled for influence. These divisions had not emerged in isolation. They were the lingering aftermath of political upheavals that had shaken Britain only a generation earlier, events that would culminate in rebellion, brutal trials, and the exile of hundreds of prisoners across the Atlantic. Wardrow then writes, in this he recommended charity and ingenuousness in dealing with those of the Episcopal communion who did not think it fit to join with us. He advised avoiding harshness and bitterness of spirit toward them, and he told us that morosity and disingenuous behavior would in no way recommend us in dealing with them. Some looked upon these expressions as containing a tacit reflection upon ourselves. He certainly delivered a very neat and well-worded discourse. Even within the assembly, reactions to the sermon were mixed. Some listeners believed the remarks about charity toward Episcopalians were indirectly criticizing members of their own church. The divisions were still raw, because within living memory, Britain had witnessed rebellion in the name of religion and monarchy, a rebellion that would end in one of the most feared judicial campaigns in English history. Wardrow then records the proceedings of the assembly. Mr. John Curry, Minister of Haddington, was chosen moderator. Next to him in votes was Mr. Thomas Wilvey in the Canongate, who would certainly have carried it if he had not made a great stir about the weakness of his health. Mr. Cameron in Kirkcudbright was next in votes, and Mr. George Berkeley, who was not present. Also named were Mr. Armstrong, Mr. Lenning, and Mr. Rogers. The moderator served as the presiding officer of the assembly, and even these elections could reflect deeper political alignments within the church. Wardrow then describes a message sent from the crown. The Queen's letter was read. It ran in the common form and almost in the same words as the last. Her Majesty expressed great satisfaction with the peaceable and harmonious proceedings of the former assemblies. She recommended that men of learning and piety should be placed in vacant churches. She urged that the growth of popery should be restrained, and she recommended the Earl of Glasgow as a person very tender of and acceptable to the Church of Scotland. She assured us of her protection and of maintaining our government as established by law. The Queen mentioned here was Queen Anne. and during this period, the British monarch traditionally addressed the assembly to affirm support for the Church of Scotland. It was a reminder that religion and political authority were closely connected, but beneath these formal proceedings lay memories of rebellion, exile, and harsh punishment, events that had shaped the world Wardrow was describing. In the closing portion of his letter, he writes, "The commissioner's speech followed in nearly the same strain. A committee was appointed for answering the Queen's letter. Other committees were appointed as usual. Tomorrow at 9 is set for prayer. I have no public news. Pray take care of yourself. I am in perfect health. Give my service to all friends, and I remain, in haste, your own R.W." But the quiet church proceedings Wardrow described were only part of the story. To understand the tensions behind this letter, we must look back to the rebellion that had shaken Britain only a few decades earlier, the uprising led by the Duke of Monmouth, and the brutal trials that followed. At first glance, this letter seems almost ordinary, a minister writing home about church business, but behind these quiet proceedings lay the memory of a rebellion that had shaken the kingdom only a generation earlier, a rebellion that ended in mass executions, exile, and one of the most feared judicial campaigns in English history. To understand the tensions Robert Wardrow was living in, we have to step back a generation, to the summer of 1685. At that time, England was already divided over religion, the monarchy, and the future direction of the kingdom. Into that uncertainty stepped a man who believed he could claim the throne, James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, the illegitimate son of King Charles II. In June of 1685, Monmouth landed in the west of England and quickly began gathering supporters. One eyewitness account describes the extraordinary reception he received when he arrived in the town of Taunton. Let's look at the actual page. The streets were so thronged with people that men could scarcely enter, all endeavoring to manifest their joy at his coming. Their houses, doors, and streets garnished with green boughs, herbs, and flowers, the emblems of prosperity. The next day, 26 gentlewomen, virgins, presented colors to his grace, prepared at the charge of the townsmen. The celebration was almost ceremonial. Monmouth was welcomed not simply as a rebel leader, but as a hopeful alternative to the reigning king. Many Protestants feared the rule of King James II, who was openly Catholic. For them, Monmouth represented the possibility of restoring Protestant influence in the kingdom, but the rebellion would not last long. Only a few weeks later, the rebel army would face the royal forces in what would become one of the most dramatic battles ever fought on English soil, the Battle of Sedgemoor. Once again, we can turn to the eyewitness accounts, and now began as fierce a battle as perhaps ever was fought in England in so short a time. Our foot fought as well as ever foot fought, but not a horse came up. Our foot, having shot away all their ammunition, were forced to retreat, being all in confusion. The battle ended in disaster for Monmouth's forces. The rebellion collapsed almost overnight. Many rebels were killed in the fighting, others were captured while trying to flee. But what followed the defeat of the rebellion would become even more infamous than the battle itself. The trials that followed were remembered by history as the Bloody Assizes. These trials were presided over by one of the most feared judges in English history, Lord Chief Justice George Jeffreys. Let's look again at the language used by those who witnessed the aftermath. A certain barbarous joy seemed to grin through his bloody eyes whenever he sentenced any of the poor souls to death and torment, making all the West an Akeldama, with gibbets and bodies hanging in every place. Across towns and villages in the west of England, executions became a public spectacle. Gibbets lined the roads, bodies were displayed as warnings. The punishments for treason were not only severe, they were designed to terrify. One official warrant from the time describes the preparations for the executions in chilling detail. Erect the gallows in the most public place, provide halters to hang the traitors, and faggots to burn the bowels of 4 traitors. For many of the captured rebels, execution was not the only fate. Hundreds of prisoners were sentenced to transportation. They were removed from England and shipped across the Atlantic. One rebel surgeon later recorded the experience of being transported to the Caribbean. Let's look at his account. In order to our transportation, we were removed to Weymouth and shipped aboard a vessel bound for Barbados. The passage was very sickly, insomuch that 9 of my companions were buried in the sea. For the authorities, these prisoners were not merely rebels, they were also a source of profit. One piece of correspondence written at the time makes that calculation disturbingly clear. Each prisoner will be worth £10, if not £15 apiece. Human lives reduced to a financial value. By the time Robert Wardrow wrote his letter in 1709, these events were still within living memory. The rebellion of Monmouth, the executions of the Bloody Assizes, and the exile of hundreds of prisoners across the Atlantic. These events left deep scars across Britain, scars that continued to shape the religious and political divisions Wardrow was quietly describing in his correspondence. What you are looking at here are not modern interpretations of history. These are original government manuscripts written in the 18th century. They are part of the official paper trail produced during a period of rebellion, political upheaval, and the eventual fall of a royal dynasty that had ruled the British Isles for more than a century. To understand these documents, it helps to briefly step back and look at the larger picture. The dynasty at the center of this story was the House of Stewart. The Stuarts had originally come from Scotland, and by the early 17th century, they had inherited the thrones of England, Scotland, and Ireland. For generations, they ruled the kingdoms of Britain, but their reign was marked by intense political and religious conflict. By the late 1700s, tensions had reached a breaking point. One figure who emerged from this turmoil was James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth. Monmouth was the son of King Charles II. Although he was born outside the king's marriage, many supporters believed he had a legitimate claim to the throne. In the year 1685, Monmouth landed in the west of England and declared himself king. This uprising became known as the Monmouth Rebellion. Thousands of supporters rallied to his cause: farmers, laborers, tradesmen, and dissenters who believed the Stuart line should continue through him. But the rebellion ended quickly. The two armies met at the Battle of Sedgemoor. During that single night battle, Monmouth's forces were defeated and the rebellion collapsed. What followed was one of the most severe crackdowns in English history. Captured rebels were brought before special courts presided over by the Lord Chief Justice George Jeffreys. These trials became infamous under the name of the Bloody Assizes. Hundreds of prisoners were condemned, some were executed, others received a different sentence: transportation. Instead of death, they were shipped across the Atlantic and sold into years of forced labor in Britain's overseas colonies. But the struggle surrounding the Stuart dynasty did not end there. Only a few years later, the Stuarts themselves were pushed from power during the political upheaval known as the Glorious Revolution. King James II was forced into exile, and a new ruling order took control of Britain. Supporters of the displaced dynasty did not disappear. They continued organizing in hopes of restoring the Stuart line to the throne. These supporters became known as Jacobites. Throughout the early 18th century, a series of uprisings broke out in Scotland and parts of England. The most famous of these occurred in 1745 under Charles Edward Stuart, often remembered as Bonnie Prince Charlie. When these rebellions failed, the consequences were again severe. Large numbers of prisoners were captured, and this brings us back to the document now appearing on the screen. This handwritten list records individuals taken during the suppression of the Jacobite movement. Officials carefully wrote down each person's name. They recorded their age, their profession, their county of origin, their height, and even their physical appearance. Each line represents a real individual caught up in the aftermath of rebellion. For example, here we see the name James Nielsen, a laborer from Aberdeen, age 36. Next to his name, officials recorded a brief physical description: black, swarthy, slender. Just below him appears another entry: James Lackey, a weaver from Edinburgh. His description is written simply as black, straight. Further down the page we find George Bain, a laborer from Aberdeen, described as swarthy, and another entry lists John Stuart, a laborer whose appearance is recorded as ruddy. These descriptions were not written as commentary. They were identifying marks, much like a prison register. Officials used them so prisoners could be recognized if they escaped or when they were transferred from one place to another. The list itself tells us something important. These prisoners came from different towns and professions: laborers, craftsmen, tradesmen, and servants. Yet they all shared the same fate. They had been caught up in the suppression of the Stuart cause. Once recorded in documents like this, many of them were transported overseas. Government correspondence from the same period confirms that ships carrying captured rebels were sent across the Atlantic. Some were sent to the Caribbean colonies. Others were transported to North America. Records mention destinations such as Barbados, Jamaica, and Virginia. In other words, the political conflicts of Britain did not remain confined to the islands themselves. Rebellion at home often led to exile across the Atlantic world, and that is why documents like this prisoner list are so valuable. They preserve the names and descriptions of individuals who were swept into one of the most dramatic political struggles in British history: the fall of the Stuart dynasty, the rise of the Jacobite movement, and the transportation of prisoners that followed in its wake. When we look closely at these handwritten pages, we are not just reading history, we are looking directly at the administrative records of a government trying to control rebellion and track the fate of those who opposed it. Each name on this page represents a life caught in that moment, a moment when the fall of a royal house sent thousands of its supporters into prison, exile, and transportation across an expanding empire. And it is through documents like these that the story can still be reconstructed today. Before we close out, if you found this examination of the original documents helpful, take a moment to support the channel. One of the most effective ways to help this research reach more people is simply to like the video. That small action tells the platform that viewers value this kind of historical investigation, and it helps push the material out to a wider audience. If you would like to go deeper into the sources, additional documents, notes, and extended breakdowns are available on our Substack. That is where we post longer articles, primary source references, and additional material that cannot always fit into a single video. You will find the link to the Substack in the description below. And if you would like to see more examinations of original manuscripts, prisoner lists, and historical records like the ones we looked at today, consider subscribing so you do not miss the next release. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next investigation.